Okay, we're now into the Sash fighting and self-defense part of the DVD. We need to cover a few points before we get into some of the technical elements. Um, to become proficient, if you want to actually use soft weapons for self-defense, you need to do a few things. Okay, and the first thing is you actually have to practice hitting things with them. If this is only a conceptual weapon where you swing it in the air and where your teacher teaches you a few techniques and you go through the movements, you might get a belt this way, but this is never going to result in knowledge of how to use the weapon. Um, Predominantly because of the backlash. Okay, when you hit something with a stick, the stick will not fly back and hit you in the face, but a sash or a weighted soft weapon will do it 9 times out of 10. Okay, so you need to understand backlash, and you need to understand what happens when you hit things with this tool. Now, the second thing is that you need experience actually fighting or sparring with it. This is not an easy tool to incorporate in sparring or in fighting, but well, I'll demonstrate a little bit of that for you here in the DVD. But it's important that you at least get comfortable adapting, okay? Because nobody is going to throw the perfect punch, and nobody is going to move the right way as it is when you're training, when somebody throws a punch and they hold it out and then you apply the technique and now you're good. It doesn't work this way. So you need experience applying these on a resisting opponent. And that doesn't mean it needs to be all out or at 100%, but it does mean that you need to practice with somebody that is not giving you the techniques all the time, okay? So we covered a couple of the grips, or we're going to cover more of them in a minute, but we talked about the weave grip, which is where my hand is through. Now, the advantage of this grip is that I can still fight when my wrists are bound and my hands are free. If there's enough slack, I can still throw proper techniques, I can still fight, and then when I need it, I can engage the sash to wrap, bind, or throw. This is useful practice. It gets you thinking about the tool, but not overly focused on using it for every technique. It's a good way to transition from theory into practice. Okay? And the last note before we start, this may sound strange, but use your intelligence. I had my second chain whip instructor. I had a conversation with him one night over translation, and I still to this day don't know if it was a funny translation or if he meant what I heard. But I asked him, do you fight much, or you don't seem to teach a lot of the fighting elements, and he said, I don't fight, I'm not a fighter. And at that time he was a Shaolin monk for most of his life and later was a national champion of Wushu. His skills were exceptional, but I asked him, do you ever use this? Like, have you fought before? I mean, how would you apply a chain whip in a self-defense situation if you've never fought with it or if you don't like to fight? And he simply said, I would use my intelligence, which is a very funny translation, but I thought about it for years. And I think that what he means is that we all have a wealth of experience, okay? You've been training for years, you know how to punch, you know how to kick, you know how to fight, you know what happens when you hit somebody a certain way, you should know certain anatomical weaknesses. And if I understood him correctly, he was simply saying that I would apply my vast knowledge of fighting and self-defense, I would simply transition it to a new tool. Okay, so he's already an expert with the tool. He's already an expert in martial arts. Whether he fights with it or not, he still has the ability then to think freely, to apply this weapon in a way that maybe he's never used it before, but he could transition his prior knowledge into an effectively. So use your intelligence. And one more, a note on practicality. All of the YouTube warriors out there like to talk about the practicality of certain techniques. This would work, that wouldn't work. Ultimate fighting champions are the best out there. Mixed martial artists are the best. Traditional martial arts suck. So on and so forth. There is nothing inherently practical about any technique. Okay, there are simple techniques like punching somebody in the head that work more often than not. And then there are very complex techniques like the ones I'm teaching in this DVD that will not work for 99.9% of the people out there because they won't put the time in. Okay, if you want to be proficient with this tool, you need to put the time in, you need to understand the weapon, and you need to practice applying it on a level that most people will never go. Okay? The other thing to keep in mind is that these are self-defense techniques. They are not cage fighting techniques. The assumption is not that I'm fighting a well-structured, well-prepared, expert fighter with these techniques. It's that I have a belt, I have a weapon, it's dangling, it may be in the evening, and I'm being attacked and have time to respond quickly. But on both sides, there's adrenaline going, we're both nervous, and we both have to react very quickly to it. And these techniques assume that my opponent may not be well structured in some cases, or that I can at least read him well enough to counter and manipulate him quickly. Okay? So with anything, whether or not something is practical has nothing to do with the technique. How far are you willing to train and take these techniques is the only question that matters. Okay, before we discuss exact techniques, specific techniques, we're going to go into some of the principles that underlie them. Okay? A lot of the ones that I'll show you are based on locking and controlling techniques. I think that the Sash provides a tremendous amount of leverage for wrapping and binding and controlling, which is why I tend to focus on those at close quarters. Now, the thing to keep in mind with all these is that you should never assume that your opponent is going to give you a limb. They're not going to stand around and wait for you to wrap the arm. This is a very complex and technical action that you have only a split second to perform. So you need to include other principles that are much deeper in order to make this work. Now, you should assume that when your opponent throws a strike, if he's well structured, he's going to pull the arm back. This is only a dream scenario, and you find it in traditional martial arts classes where the student is trying to help the teacher look good. This is not very real. When you train these techniques, this is okay in the beginning, but they need to eventually draw the technique back in order for you to learn if your technique is effective. The second thing is not worrying about the hand. If you're good enough to at least make contact with the first hand, you don't need to worry about that hand. What you have to worry about is the one that's coming right after that. Okay, so if your strategy does not immediately deal not only with the first contact, but what's coming a split second later, then it's a fundamentally flawed strategy. Okay, and when you're dealing with the Sash, both your hands are bound. You don't have tools left over to deal with multiple things. So you have one technique to deal with multiple possibilities and issues coming from your opponent. Now, from my experience, a lot of the systems that I've studied have had techniques grouped according to either the level of difficulty or, in some cases, some arbitrary combination of techniques so that they can be learned at one time or another. Now, I don't want to hand you a handful of empty techniques. We're going to cover quite a wide range of techniques, but I want, first and foremost, to give you guys the principles that make them work. If you understand the principles, you can create an infinite number of scenarios and techniques that are just as effective. You can extend what you learned from me well beyond what I'm teaching you. And I think that that has a lot more value. So with each of the technique series, don't think that they are specific techniques. We're going to be applying certain principles, fundamental principles of intercepting the technique or the punch, and then transitioning into a few possible locks and takedowns. Okay, the first thing now is that when an opponent strikes you, if your reaction and your response should not be the same regardless of his structure, his speed, and his ability. You need to you need to adapt to the situation. If he throws a punch and he's overcommitted, for me to try to enter or follow his technique back is silly. I should draw him out and blend with his force and take him with me. If he's a well-structured opponent, for example, a trained boxer, and he pulls that punch back and is coming with a flurry, for me to try to draw him out or trap that arm would not be a very smart strategy. He's going to have the arm retracted and throwing a second punch before I can react. But if I can follow and enter with him and send his arm or his elbow into a place that breaks his structure, then I bought myself time to apply a decent lock. Okay? So a lot of this is understanding the principles of interception as well as the possible scenarios in which to use them. Okay? Not all techniques and methods are applicable at all times. You need a wide array because there are an infinite number of possibilities. Now we're going to get into a few of the possible grips. Some of these are very, very basic and common sense. We'll just call this an up grip, okay, or a palm up grip, palm down grip. we've got, with any one of these, we can have multiple wraps. So if I've got a palm up grip, I can wrap them once, wrap them twice, and now I've got a much tighter sash. And then we've got the weave, which we talked about very early on in the DVD, which looks like this. Okay, hand free, I can strike, I can use the steel ball that comes in the end, and I can ignore the sash almost entirely until it's either pulled or until I feel ready to engage it with a certain technique. Okay, now for most of the techniques, we'll cover these very basically. Pressing and popping technique, as we talked about, is not just pushing, but it also requires a snap with the pop. And you do this through the target. You accelerate through the target with it. Now, for a few of the techniques, and this is difficult to see, but on certain inward blocking, okay, we have high blocks with the sash, low blocks, inside, outside, but these kinds of blocks, inside and outside, don't give you a lot of control. In my opinion, they should only be used if you have a very strong, thick weapon. If you're using a chain, for example, and your opponent has a knife, this may make sense. It will create distance between you and the weapon, and it may be effective at disarming, okay? But if it's a bare knuckle strike, I'm committing both my arms to one of his, and I've got no structure left. He's got a second hand that I need to worry about. So in general, if I'm going to attack the one hand, I need to make sure that I'm connecting first with a part of my body, okay? So we use inner forearm blocks. I don't cover these much, but you can also, with a weave, you can use an outer forearm and wind up looping and wrapping with that. It's just quite difficult, okay? So with a palm up grip, we work to the inner forearms to work the blocking techniques. Okay, now from there we work into the wraps. And this is quite simple. So as I block with the inner forearm, the lower hand, the bottom hand, simply loops up and around. Okay, and this is regardless of which hand I'm doing it to. Now we have a second technique that starts with the inner forearm. The other hand will still loop, but I complete a circle with the hand that's gripping the sash. This will wind up being more of an outer wrist lock technique. Okay, and here we have an upward block with the same grip, but where the forearms don't make contact first, the sash simply catches on the upswing, and then we loop into a high shoulder lock, similar to when we're blocking with the inner forearm. Okay, and here we're moving in into an armpit armbar from a high block with the sash. As we do the high block,
the right hand initially remains static while the left hand loops over the top, and you guide your own left elbow all the way over his arm, and then both arms wind up pulling high with the hand, pulling the hand high while driving the elbow down. Okay, and the downward trapping block, this one is also a looser sash posture. We don't make contact with the arms first, and it tends to be a little bit more, have a little bit more slack in the sash than any of the other blocks. And this is useful because it gives you a bit more drag and pull. While we want the other ones to be a bit sharper because the hand is quite close to the head, this one we can use with a step back or really draw down hard on his arm to off balance. So it tends to be more of a popping motion than some of the other ones.
Okay, the first principle that we're going to cover, I'm going to refer to as assisting the technique or blending with the technique. So if your opponent comes and throws a strong committed strike, and a lot of people say nobody would throw a punch like that, which is overcommitted, a wild haymaker, or extending beyond, they've never seen a real street fight before. This is by far the most common scenario. The person's angry, they're not thinking about defending themselves, they just want to deck somebody. And in a case like this, you can help them along that same path. If you see the technique clearly, you draw them out even further out of their structure with a slight pull or a tug. Now, a lot of people say it's impossible to grab a punch or it happens too fast. And that's probably a fair assessment if you're actually trying to grab a punch out of the air. But this is not what skilled interceptors of techniques do. They work with the opponent's natural inclination, and it buys them time and it gives them a chance to apply a lock. So if I pull slightly down at the same time that he's striking, he's extended beyond himself, and it gives me a second then to find a controlling lock or a controlling grip and redirect that force as soon as he starts to retract. Okay, and it's human nature that when you pull in one direction or if you push, there's going to be a quick reflex in the opposite direction. So they punch, and by pulling slightly and assisting down, he's naturally going to pull up and pull back. So with that slight tug, I can redirect that force into the next technique. Okay, there are not a lot of easy techniques with the sash that come from this, but you could always view the sash again as a reserve tool to where if you grab and slightly pull, you can always get one or two wraps if you've got control of the limb, take down, and then use the sash to continue binding that person after that.
Okay, as this takedown is shown here, the wrap is a little bit excessive, but the idea is that if you can trap well with an empty hand, you can always use the sash then to wrap and bind. And if you leave enough length on one side, you can use it to tie up the other hand behind his back, or you can wrap one side around the head, and so on and so forth.
The next method of intercepting, I like to refer to as destructuring. The idea that for anybody to throw a powerful punch, they need to be structured. The spine needs to be in alignment. You can't have the shoulders too extended beyond their center. And in order to take the power out of somebody's strike or to break them down quickly, you simply break that structure, okay? So I call it destructuring. Other martial arts would refer to this kind of method as a hard-style trapping. Now, a hard trap gives me a little bit more leeway, but trapping needs to be practiced well. It needs to be like a shotgun, just coming from nothing. Very fast, hard trap into the forearm, and it should be heavy enough that you feel it in the legs, that your opponent feels it in his legs. If you don't shake the structure to that extent, the trap is probably not going to buy you enough time to control that arm or to prevent a second strike. Okay, but if you can practice this and work on it to an extent where that hand is heavy enough and fast enough and explosive enough to where it shakes their structure, then it buys you a lot of time. And this can be done against an overcommitted strike. It can also be done against a well-structured strike like the one we talked about in terms of a good retraction. Okay, now some of the techniques that may come out of this empty hand, the first one is a simple shoulder lock. Okay, so after a hard trap, I can shoot my hand in, bring my hand up to the just above the elbow, and create a lever where I press down on near the tricep region close to the elbow, and I lift my elbow, creating a shoulder lock this way. Okay, it's very fast, very effective, and can result in a ground pin or a locking pin on the ground as well. Okay, here we're going to look at the shoulder lock entry from the various grip, from straight hand same side grip and a cross hand grab. And this is simply to show you how to enter this lock from the traditional type of grab before we move into the interception. And here we're entering into the same high shoulder lock from a hard downward trap. Again, the sash needs to come down with enough force to drag the arm and the body forward so that your opponent requires at least a split second to recover his balance and structure. And from that, when he starts to pull up against your downward force, you use that slight tug and you redirect up into his shoulder. Okay. The other version is a hard trap that will come into what, again, in Filipino martial arts, I believe they're referred to as a linikun, which is a turning throw, which is where you turn the head, the body spirals as you throw them under. And I'll just demonstrate that quickly here to see the mechanics of it. Now with the sash, we don't complete the throw, but the entry is of great value. Okay, so after the trap and strike, once you've pressed slightly to the outside and taken their balance away a little bit, all that's required then is one step back with the left leg, and you've got a standing choke that is very fast, very effective, and very painful.
Okay, I do need to add for this technique that it again is very dangerous. If you train this with a partner, do not make a habit of applying this choke with much, if any, force. It doesn't take much to make somebody pass out. It could happen in 5 to 10 seconds if it's tight enough. So treat this one with extreme caution and respect your partners.
Now, using the destructuring principle with the sash, this one will predominantly come, if you're using the sash only and not simply trapping and then wrapping, will come from a downward trap with the sash, or a downward block. So as a punch is coming in, when you whip hard and roll it, you pull them down at the same time. You pull them out of their range. It gives you time to complete the wrap, and if they draw back, in this particular case, you can either wrench over and complete a shoulder lock and a throw, which has the foundation of an outer wrist lock, okay? Or you can actually raise the elbow and apply a genuine wrist lock by pressing the elbow against the back of the hand. It's a very interesting lock that's worth playing with, and at first it's hard to have accuracy with it, but after a while you find that it's very smooth after the wrap occurs to catch the fist with the elbow and lever that over. Yeah. Okay, and from that same entry now, once we've applied the hard downward trap and wrap with the sash, let's assume now that they're going to throw a second punch if they still have enough structure to do so.
The second technique is even easier to intercept, assuming that you've done a proper trap initially. He doesn't have too many options from this point, and he's more likely than not going to throw a somewhat of a direct strike with the left hand. You just intercept it with your right palm and guide it to the outside. And you can make this takedown even a little bit more aggressive by stepping in and blocking off his outside leg. This will prevent an easy fall on his part and attempt to twist and torque his body and send him straight down.
Okay, and if you're using a weave grip with the hand free, you can apply a few interesting locks here as well, and we'll take a look at those.
And with the first entry, we're closing off the body, another form of destructuring where we're essentially using a forceful outside pari and at the same time gripping the other end of the sash with the same hand that has the weave. And from here we've got 2 different takedowns you can have a look at. And next we'll be catching a wild hook or a haymaker technique. With this one we're just going to step to the outside of the punch and catch somewhere near the elbow with the sash. This is obviously not, it should not be considered a defensive maneuver. This is attacking the arm. So assuming you have enough perspective on your opponent's structure and ability to see this technique a little bit early, you need to be well outside of it in order to catch it properly. And back to our hard downward trap. After the trap is executed, if you get a good off-balancing pull and you get him leaning forward, it's not that far then to reach down and loop the front knee. And once we do this, you've got him pretty well tied up and he doesn't have a lot of capacity to strike or maneuver at this point.
Okay, we'll look next at the method of intercepting I like to call following or sticking. This method of intercepting now assumes that your opponent is probably a little bit more structured than somebody that's just throwing wild punches. It assumes there's probably going to be a retraction of the punch or the technique after it's extended. And the whole idea is that once contact is made, as soon as they start to pull, I can feel that with my sensitivity and training, I can feel that and follow the technique back in. Now I don't just want to follow it back to his guard, but what I want to do is follow it and redirect his retraction to a position that puts him out of balance or that shakes his structure a little bit. For the most part, we're going to use this technique is going to wind up resulting in a shoulder lock, but I want to demonstrate this principle from a couple of other scenarios. Okay, so the first is lifting the elbow, following in. I meet the technique here, I follow in and I shoot it up to the elbow. Now this is not a finishing technique and it's not a quick lock, but it's a transitional technique that allows me to gain control of my opponent before I apply a finishing lock. Okay, it will look at full speed, it'll look almost like I've caught the punch or that I've gone straight into a lock because I'll quickly flow into the next one. But the truth is I'm working for positioning. And from this position, once his elbow is lifted and I've got control, he cannot throw, at least not for a few seconds and not very well, throw another punch. He also can't use that arm because once the shoulder is slightly elevated or dislodged, there's no more strength in the joint. There's no more strength in the arm. Okay? So this buys me the time then to apply other shoulder locking techniques, either with or without the sash.
Okay, so this next interception is not consistent with the following and sticking principle, but this is to simply show the finish of the lock and pin that we're going to move into from the initial entry. This is a different application. This could more be considered a blending or circling technique, possibly a trapping technique in terms of the interception. But the finish is what's important here, and to see how once we've intercepted with the sash, how we're going to manipulate the arm and body down into a full pin.
The second one is an older white crane kung fu term called clamping, which is when the technique comes in, you catch it, you guide it into your other hand, and you quickly follow the retraction back. Okay, this is probably the most rapid interception and application of an outer wrist lock because the hands are already in position. All I need to do from this posture is a slight tug or twist, and the wrist is gone, or they break, fall, and go down. Now, if we look at it in terms of sash technique, the shoulder lift, the first entry that we talked about, can be done in two ways. The first is a speed version, where I quickly wrap and follow, shooting the sash behind the back. I release, and then I've got one hand bound already. This is a very fast, it's a speed-based application. It doesn't give me control of the joint, it just works with their natural inclination to retract the limb.
And you can see here a few times I'm pinching or gripping champion's love handles here. This type of pinch really hurts like hell, and the idea is that it's just a quick jolt to get them to flinch and send the other hand back to you rather than requesting it.
The second one, once contact is made, I use to redirect the force up into that shoulder, which again shakes their structure, pulls them up onto the balls of their feet, and gives me control enough to turn into a spinning shoulder lock or ground pin. Okay, and the next method of intercepting is called sealing. Quite often this is also accompanied by circling, but for the purposes of demonstrating right away, we'll just work on the first component. Now, with open hands, this would normally look like an inside pari, which is blocking if they're throwing a right hand punch, blocking to the inside of the wrist hard this way, okay? Now, the intention is not just to force and power and cause pain, but what we want to prevent is the retraction or the bending of the elbow. Okay, so as the fist rotates out, if there's enough pressure on the inner forearm here, I can't retract my elbow, at least for a second or two. Okay, this buys enough time to apply a wide range of locking techniques. I'll go through just a few of them here to give you a sample of how this can be applied without a sash. But it all comes from the fundamental principle of sealing. If you don't seal the joint, it is very difficult to work into this position from a lot of other postures. Okay, but if you can wind up sealing this and circling out, it has two benefits. One is you step to the outside of that person's range. They can't retract the joint, which gives you the limb temporarily, but you're also moving away from the second hand. Okay, so if we start here, my joint's coming out, I no longer get a straight shot, I have to follow you, and if you're quick enough, I can't punch around my body. So for at least 1 to 2 seconds, I have the ability to control and manipulate that joint. Now this is fundamental in sash fighting because you don't have your hands. So all of the technique has to be applied through sensitivity, connection, and leverage. Okay, so it has to be very fast, but you also need to buy time and connectivity with the limb by sealing the joint. Okay, and without So sealing the joint gives you enough time to complete a full wrap, circle the technique, and apply the takedown, as we talked about. The first technique that we'll look at is the outer wrist lock, and I use this technique in the demonstration. It's a very fast, hard, and powerful takedown, and it has an awfully convenient and nice finish that once the person is down, with a slight tug and twist, you can roll them into a shoulder lock that we've looked at from some of the other postures. This shoulder lock also is convenient. You can easily slip right out of it, but you also have control and leverage of the joint if you continue to pull up. But it all comes from that initial contact, which has to seal the joint.
Okay, so once we've intercepted the first technique with an outer wrist lock type of motion, if a second technique comes, we can also catch that one and guide it over the first technique. We can then form a second wrap around the second punch, and we wind up having a combination of an outer wrist lock or an arm bar takedown. This is quite a painful lock when it's done quickly.
Now let's look at a scenario where you've stepped out, you've sealed the joint, you've got a good control of the wrist, but maybe not enough to continue the throw. Maybe they can resist a little bit, or maybe they've already initiated a second punch. Once that first wrap occurs, again, extending that elbow or that forearm up will allow you to redirect the technique, wrap the second punch, and sweep or continue the throw.
In this case, we'll be sealing the arm with a weave grip instead of with our previous circling lock. Okay, next we look at the high block motion. This is another form of sealing the joint. When the sash pushes upward against the arm, the elbow is also locked out, which buys you a few seconds. And in this case, we're going to loop around, as we looked at previously in the blocking segment. And we're going to form an armpit armbar, where we enter with the same side of the body. So the left side is going to turn in toward his right side. And you're going to bar the elbow up by lifting the hand and driving down the arm or the armpit. We can make this a submission lock by driving all the way to the ground, sweeping your left leg straight out and landing on the left side of the body. Once you reach the ground, you use your upper back to pin him and continue to bar the elbow and to pull the hand upward.
Now, sealing the technique with a weave grip is very interesting. It provides a tremendous amount of leverage, and it's very fast, and you don't have to worry as much about the retraction, because once you feed the weave over and you grab the other end of the sash, you've got great control of the joint, and it can lead to a whole array of different techniques. Once you've got this connection and you've moved and you've pulled the joint out to the right, I have a few options, one of which is I simply tug down to the ground, which in general, if you've got the person's 2 feet, you want to work to the front right or the front back quadrant. You work to the triangle, yeah? So pull to one of the triangle points, punch the ground, and they'll fall right down. Okay, the other option is once I'm here, if I want to move back into the other side, tug hard and back across so that once they're here, I close their body off with their own limb. This again, it buys me time. So even though it looks like these movements are very complex, with every movement, I am controlling the entire person's positioning and structure. It's the only way to execute advanced or complex throws, and you need to be very sensitive to it. If you're using force and just trying to wrench the person's arm from one side to another, it's never going to work. It's force versus force. Okay, but if you get that and you can circle in, down, and across for a couple of the throws that we're going to look at, then you're able to seal the joint, control and close off the body, and he's not going to be able to defend very well. Now, whether you can execute the throw at that point depends on your conditioning, but at least it's going to prevent him from hitting you again, and it will give you enough time to enter with an appropriate technique. Okay, next we're going to look at a series of techniques from the sealing of the joint using the weave grip. I need to give you a word of caution here. These are very, very dangerous techniques. If you're not working with a trained partner, move extremely slowly. Don't jerk, don't twitch, don't do anything too quickly. It is very easy to dislocate a shoulder, hyperextend, or break the elbow, or drop somebody clean on their head if you're not sure how to throw properly. If you want to learn these techniques well, I highly recommend you look into a hard style Hakpido, Aikido, and possibly some jiu-jitsu systems. Okay, my foundation came from Shinmu Hakpido, and you can learn what's called a series of, I believe they're called deep locks. Unfortunately, I don't recall all of the terminology for them, but it's essentially a grip that would come under and grip the underside of somebody's wrist, which would then slide into locking the hand. Now, when you're working with a sash like this, you don't have to worry about the grip. You don't have to worry about how exactly you're gripping the hand, because the sash provides all that leverage. But you do need to learn the body mechanics, and you need to learn how to throw properly so that you're not injuring your partner and or yourself for that matter at the same time. Okay, the next technique is an arm bar. After we close off the limb, we're going to sweep it down and across the opponent's body. The left hand, the free hand, can strike throughout the process. And the key to this lock is to make sure that the opponent's hand is well below his elbow. That provides you a lot more leverage for the lock. And your own left arm should be above his elbow and ideally toward the center of his tricep. The deeper the better for this lock. Okay, next we have a Hakpido style shoulder throw. This lock is particularly mean because it has the potential to break the opponent's elbow throughout the throw. You need to be especially careful when you're performing this because this will lock the opponent's elbow out, and as you tug down on the wrist, it can certainly pop the elbow out. So you need to go very slowly throughout this lock. The key after you close his body off is to shoot your hips in deep, to begin to bend and pull down on the hand, and ideally your opponent's going to try to throw himself over you because of the pain that's caused toward the elbow. Okay, next we move toward an outside or a 360 twisting lock. This lock is surprisingly easy and effective with the sash. It's much easier to perform with the sash than it is bare hand, actually. You just want to make sure that you close the opponent's body off and off balance well before you initiate the throw. That'll at least prevent them from resisting. And as you step across, you want to stay low and close toward your opponent. You don't want to be too far away from them. So stretch his hand out over your head. You should be able to keep eye contact with his hand the whole time. If you can't see his hand, you're probably not close enough. Next we have the Hakpido version of the fireman's carry, also known as the wheel throw, a version of a wheel throw. Now with this technique, after we close the opponent's body off, you want to step deep between both of his legs and stay very close to him. And while you pull his arm over with the sash, you're lightly going to lift up the back or the left side of your body and creating a kind of wheel. Now this is extremely painful, and it's more likely that your opponent is going to probably initiate a throw or a fall himself because of the pain that's in the elbow. Be very careful when practicing this. It's extremely easy to break that joint. And the final point is simply to be pulling down, pulling the hand down as you lift the back. Okay, and the last technique here, it will seem like it has a little bit excessive footwork, but again, if you close the body off properly, you'll be able to, it'll buy you enough time to do the necessary footwork. The key here is to maintain a very low and close stance to your opponent, and to extend his arm as far in front of your own body as you turn as possible. And you want to make sure that his hand is as low as possible throughout the movement so that he can't pull back or respond. The higher his hand is, the less control you have.
Yeah.
And the final principle of intercepting that we're going to look at is what I would call immediate locking, which is where as soon as I have the chance, as soon as the arm starts to extend, I apply a lock that happens at first contact. And this very simply would look like if somebody is striking, I simply hyperextend the elbow, break the elbow, hit the wrist this way. One strike here, and it pops. Okay, this is a very quick break and debilitating, very dangerous. But we can apply it with the sash as well, which is quite interesting. And then if I have a weave grip, if I don't, I can still apply it. But with a weave grip, I can actually pari, step to the inside, and strike at the same time. With that strike, I'm also tightening that lock on the arm and hyperextending the elbow, which then transitions right into your standard arm bar if the elbow is not damaged yet. But yeah, try it out. Okay, at this stage, we're going to go back and re-examine a couple attacking principles that maybe we haven't covered in depth quite enough. Let's assume now that you're striking with a whip and your opponent steps in instead of away. It's very common then that the sash or the whip will wind up wrapping around them. Okay, and from here you have a few options. So for example, if I'm swinging low and I intend to wrap the leg, we have a few different types of wraps and pulls from here. One of them is what I call a friction pull, which is where as the sash begins to wrap the limb, I tug it before it has a complete circle, but the friction and the speed of the wrap is sufficient enough against their own body weight to create a pull or enough friction to where it sticks and I can pull or uproot that leg with a strong pull. Okay, the next one is where I have a full wrap of the limb. And if I'm going for the leg in this case, and I want it to wrap fully, and the weight is, in the end is weighted. So you can strike down, and as it begins to wrap, you need to drop your hand below the level of the wrap itself in order for it to come across the line you're holding and actually catch. Once it catches, you've got that thing bound very tightly and have good control of the limb, if you can enter then after that. Okay, now when working with a chain, this is not as effective with some other materials, but when you're working with a chain, if you can wrap any limb, if somebody's striking and you step outside and wrap the arm, it is unbelievably powerful and tight. You don't even need to fasten it. It doesn't even need to be complete. But the chain has such a tight grip on skin. Yeah, it's a little bit gruesome, but once that starts to wrap, if you tug down, it's very difficult to resist a chain wrap. And with this, you can wrap, very easy to wrap punches, a slight wrap, a tug down will send them right to the ground. And if we look at one more, which is if I send the sash around the person's head or around an arm, and I catch the other end of it, which we've looked at in terms of a couple circular techniques, and I tug down, again, it's very difficult to resist. Okay, so in general, I want to pull toward one of the quadrants. If my stance is here, 1 foot, 2nd foot, I go for the triangle. I pull here, or I push back here, because that's where the balance is not very easy to recover from. Okay? But if you can get it wrapped around the neck, again, the pressure and the tendons and the nerves back here are so sensitive that the body will always follow any slight tug, and it'll give you a chance to throw knees or to off balance and throw. It has a lot of possibilities from there. Oh, that's a sloppy fall. But it's okay. He's paid his dues this video. Okay, we're going to look at a few options for wrapping the neck. Simply by shooting in and throwing the sash around the back of the head. Okay, the next throw I'm calling the lasso throw. Again, as we talked about in the demo, I'm not 100% sure this is a practical technique, but it's a lot of fun to train. And
you should perhaps just consider it a concept technique to experiment with and maybe learn a little bit from. Now, you'll start from a loose weave, so the wrist is not tightly locked, but the sash is around one of the wrists. And as you catch or loop it around your opponent's punch and tug, it should wind up slipping off your own wrist and tightening like a noose around your opponent's wrist.
Oh, you okay? Yeah.
From there, you're going to look to circle the sash up and around, creating a big circle with his punching hand. And this requires a great deal of practice and sensitivity to get the alignment right. Next, we just have a basic off-balancing sweep. This can be done just fine without the sash, but the sash can allow for a little bit more distance than may be required without it. Now, if the sash is grabbed, it makes it in some ways a lot easier to apply a locking technique. We can either circle inward, up and over and inward with the left hand, leading into a high shoulder lock, or we can circle in with the right hand, mimicking an outer wrist lock motion that you find in most martial arts. And here we'll just look at a few other options for when the sash is grabbed. You don't need necessarily to implement a strategy or techniques that rely on the sash. You can always work around it. If it's easier for you to kick or to headbutt or to trap and sweep the opponent's lead leg, then you should do so. You shouldn't necessarily rely on the sash only because you're holding it. You should use it if it enhances the technique. And if it makes it more complicated, simply opt for something else.
Drop. Whoa. Good.
And here we'll just look at a few techniques holding the sash. Now, just because you're holding the sash doesn't mean, again, that you need to use it for all things. You can use it as a reserve tool, which doesn't inhibit you from striking with the hands or kicking. Just call on it when it's needed.
Yeah.
We discussed earlier the pressing and popping technique in terms of blocking. And here's how you could use it offensively to attack the throat, the hips, or the knee in an aggressive forward popping motion. If you use this on a partner, avoid the neck and face at all costs. Trust me, it's very painful. And if you're actually interested in being able to use soft weapons for self-defense, you're going to need to spend some time applying them in uncontrolled situations like sparring. Here's just a few minutes sample of a little bit of free form, so I don't necessarily know the techniques that are going to come at me, but we're not using a wide range of techniques. But in terms of the timing and the structure and how they're coming in, you still need to adapt and be ready for them and see if you can apply the weapon in those cases. And you can practice using this simply against bare hand striking, as we're doing here. You'll notice that the sash here is not always used for every technique. A lot of times it's being held back for reserve, and you can still strike freely, kick freely. But should the situation arise where you see clearly a technique that's coming, or you accidentally get wound up and stuck to the opponent with the sash, that's where your techniques tend to come in.
And a few final considerations for sash fighting. Now, again, we've talked about this a couple times. If you're serious about learning this weapon, you need to hit things. You need to understand what happens when there's contact made with a soft weapon, and you need to understand the backlash. It's fundamental practical training for the weapon. Doesn't take a lot of it, but it needs enough to get a little bit familiar with it. Now, we have a few pros and cons for a weave grip, or if my hands are bound or my wrists are bound at the same time that I'm using the sash. Now, this is always something that can be used against me, okay? He can pull, he can grab, he can step on it, he can send me to the ground. So you always need to be prepared that the weave grip it provides a lot of leverage and is a very powerful tool, but you are also at the same danger that your opponent is potentially with applying some of these techniques. Your hands are already wrapped, okay? That's what you're trying to do to him. So you need to be very careful when using this grip. You have to be very well trained, drill it to death, very confident, and you need to know when to use it and when not to use it. Don't try to apply it to all techniques, but call on it when it's needed. And in this kind of a scenario, it's almost like having a fifth limb, okay? It's a very powerful tool. And along with that, the psychology of the technique should be such that even if you're doing a defensive technique, your mind needs to be on the offense. You need to be prepared to execute an offensive maneuver against an incoming strike. Okay, so even if I'm defending, if I'm receiving and performing an outer wrist lock or following and performing a shoulder lock, I'm defending myself, but these are not defensive maneuvers. You need to have the psychology of an attacker when you're executing any of them, and you need to be that well prepared for it. Anticipate the technique, be well prepared, and essentially be on the offensive, even if you're defending yourself. This may sound strange, but you need to be better than your opponent. If you're not better than your opponent, you should drop the sash and poke him in the eyes, kick him in the balls, or buy him a beer, okay? But don't insist on using a tool that is this challenging if you are not that capable with it. It requires that kind of practice. In anticipation of questions that may come, I haven't covered any leg locking or wrapping techniques in the fighting element of this DVD. I personally don't believe that the sash is strong enough or that it's an appropriate tool for dealing with kicks. Okay? I am myself a kicker. I love to kick, and I'm confident in my ability to out-kick fabric. That doesn't mean that there are not techniques that could be effective if you understand the principles and apply them. It's just at this stage, it's not something that I believe is worth studying in itself. I believe that if you're fighting a well-versed kicker, use the weave, keep protected, block with your normal tools, your forearms, your shins, or evasive footwork, and when the time is right, you can use the sash then. For example, if you catch a leg, throw, and then pin, now is the time you can use it to bind and wrap that opponent. Okay, but try not to catch a kick with the sash. It's too strong. Okay, we're at the end. I hope you've enjoyed this DVD. I hope it's been informative. I'm not terribly hard to find if you have questions about some of the content or how to execute certain techniques. If you're ever in Shanghai, pay me a visit. I do teach here. But otherwise, train hard and enjoy the art of the sash. Thanks for viewing it. So my first venture into the art of soft weapons when I was 22 years old. I had just graduated college. At that time, I was already teaching the CSU, the Colorado State University Taekwondo Club, for several years, and I had felt that I had not reached my potential, but I wasn't growing in the sense that my world wasn't expanding as quickly as it used to be. I was still becoming better and better at the techniques I was practicing, but the system I was training was limited, and I wanted to learn more. And I'd always been impressed by the soft weapons I'd seen, rarely seen, but always very impressed by them. And by a few things. I always thought the aesthetic of them, the beauty of the movement and the speed and the precision was always very impressive to me. And so at that time I left the States and I moved to China to try to seek this out a little bit. My first experience was at a Kung Fu school in the north of China, where there were several Shaolin monks who were teachers there, and one of them in particular took a liking to me. He could tell that I had experience and that I wasn't quite receiving exactly what I came for, and he offered to teach me whatever I wanted to learn on the side, which was not really accepted at the time, but we figured out a way to make it work by going out into the forest together, and he taught me all of the basics and the fundamental forms for the chain whip. At that time, I felt like I went from high school, skipped college, and dove into a graduate course in martial arts. I had never seen anybody so fast or competent with a weapon before. And it was one of these things where we're standing there, and he says, "Okay, watch me." And in the matter of 5 seconds, he did 5 or 6 extremely fast hand movements, sprinted across the forest, jumped 6 feet, and threw the dart straight out, and then started to spin it. I had no idea what he did. I couldn't see the weapon even after he started swinging it. And then he said, "Okay, now you try." And one of the reasons I wanted to do this DVD was because my experience learning the weapon was rote. I had to follow the movements. I had trouble communicating with the instructor. He was an excellent instructor, but I couldn't take the weapon and the training to the depths that I wanted to under that kind of instruction. And my priority with creating this is to essentially break what soft weapons training is down by principles, so that you don't need to learn a form and practice the same thing, but that you can learn the inherent principles and then construct any form that you want, and essentially create new techniques from the principles that are involved in that. Continuing my training, a couple of years later, I took what Master Su had given me, and I learned that form quite well. I found another Shaolin protector monk a couple years later who was also a national champion in Wushu, who developed me a bit more with the chain whip. And a couple years later, I went to the Shaolin Temple to learn the meteor hammer. All of these weapons, again, they had the same fundamentals, and once I had learned the fundamentals of the chain whip, the meteor hammer was actually a very quick and easy learn, despite the fact that it has an extra 1.5 to 2 meters of range, and it includes wraps and shoots. But fundamentally, they all come from the same source. And so throughout this DVD, as you're practicing a technique, don't think of it as learning a tool. Don't think of it as learning one particular material and one particular technique, but try to understand that anything that falls into the category of a soft weapon, you can fundamentally fall back on the same technique. Okay, and that's how I'm going to try to present it to you.